Well, thank you all for coming in here late on a Saturday afternoon. I very much appreciate your presence. My name's Bill O'Neill. I've written a number of books about Western things and gunfighting and stuff, and I was state historian for 6 years as well. I was about 13 when I first read about Billy Dixon in the book that he and his wife Olive put together toward the end of his life. I was captivated. I saw that book, incidentally, in the Corsicana Public Library. That's where I was born and raised, and I was getting books about characters like that, and there was this one, and boy, I was captivated by this heroic sharpshooting buffalo hunter. Billy triggered the most famous shot of the Old West at the Battle of Adobe Walls in 1874, and then only a few months later, as an Army Scout, he won the Medal of Honor at the Buffalo Wallow fight, and that was also in the Texas Panhandle. I wrote about him briefly in a couple of coffee table books, and then in July 2015, I participated in a meeting of the Wild West History Association in Amarillo. Our field trip, day long, consisted of 4 buses and an auto caravan out to Adobe Walls. There were about 250 of us, and I was asked to provide a program about Dixon. I hadn't written much about him, but I was the only one around who had written anything, because there hasn't been a biography of him since 1914 until this book came out just recently. I did the program out there. I had never been out there. I'd never been closer than 17 miles. That's how far the historical marker is from Adobe Walls, which is on private property. And I'd always longed to go out there. When we got out there, it had been arranged for a gentleman came out there with a Sharp's big 50 Buffalo gun, and he let us shoot blanks, of course, at the nearest plateau. There are 2 plateaus. One of them faces due east. You got a little map you got there, it'd be to the right. And it is about 6/10 of a mile or so from Adobe Walls, from the old community, out to that plateau. There is another plateau to the southeast at an angle, and it is nearly a mile out to it. Well, we were shooting at 2 guys, I was shooting blanks at 2 guys who were dressed like Indians, and they were on top of that nearer plateau, not very near, and they were barely specks. I mean, you can hardly see those guys. The picture I took of them, I put in my book, and you can just barely see them. And Billy may well have made that shot at the farther plateau. And I thought, how in the world? I tell you, after that experience, I just had to write a book about Billy, and there had not been a biography of him, as I say, in a long time, but I was not very far into this project before I realized the extraordinary importance of Olive Dixon. That's why this thing became a dual biography. It's entitled Billy and Olive Dixon, the Plainsman and His Lady. It co-stars the 2 of them, and I'll come back to her directly. First, let me focus on the remarkable frontier exploits of a youngster named Billy, who ran away to the West in 1863 when he was just 13 years old. Billy never did talk about his boyhood, never. He was not much of a talker, period, but he certainly never talked about that. And when Olive told him she had to have something for the book, well, he came up with this kind of a vague story. It takes up 1 paragraph on the front page of the little book, and that's it. He said he was born in 1850 in Western Virginia, which later became West Virginia, and that's true. Then he said he was the firstborn. He said he had a sister, but his mother died after birthing number 3. Then his father died. Neither his father, nor his mother, nor his sister were mentioned by name. So Billy and his sister, according to this version, were taken to the Missouri farm of an uncle named Tom. Then he said his sister died of typhoid fever. Within a year, he ran away from his uncle's farm. He said he took only his extra shirt and his mother's picture. This all sounded kind of, I don't know, a little fishy to me. And so I enlisted the help of my brother-in-law, who's an avid genealogist. He found that Billy wasn't the first of 3. He was the 3rd born of 7 children. They all lived to adulthood. Nobody died of typhoid fever. Billy's mother and father, he found the names. They were named William and Nancy. Billy was named after his daddy. They lived long lives. When Billy was a child, the entire family moved to Missouri, and it was from there that Billy and another boy ran away to the West in 1863. And boy, that was a common boyhood disease in those days, going away to the West. They were taken in by wood choppers. They didn't have guns with them. They didn't have anything. Wood choppers were at camps alongside the Missouri River. Boys helped cut and stack firewood for passing steamboats. I don't know if you know it, those little steamboats, the big ones, used 2 cords of firewood an hour when they were steaming on the river. Anyway, Civil War was raging. There was a terrible manpower shortage, so soon he was hired as a bullwhacker of government freight trains. He was a teamster. At first, he wasn't even big enough. Remember, he's 13. He wasn't big enough to yoke his own oxen, but he did have help from friendly colleagues, and he grew into a man with an extremely strong physique. During the next several years, he was all over the frontier of that era as one train after another, and sometimes they were mule trains. He worked as a mule skinner. I won't get into the difference between the two. I talk about that in the book. The wages were excellent. With the war going on, you just couldn't find anybody to do this kind of stuff, and these government freight trains offered double the normal wages. And the regular wages were pretty good. Furthermore, everybody was given a set of weapons for the trail. And he had never had any kind of firearm in his life. And he was presented a Sharps carbine, a little saddle model, and a Remington Army model pistol, cap and ball. And these were the first guns he'd ever had. These were Army issue. They had a ton of ammunition, and he starts practicing every night and stuff, and boy, he proved to have a gift for it. It's like some people start playing the piano when they're 3. Well, he was gifted as a marksman, as he would prove later in his life, and he just kept practicing and practicing. And by the way, every time he would change mule trains, or change trains with somebody, well, they'd present him another set of weapons. Sometimes they turned him in, sometimes they didn't. And then he served as an Army scout for best part of a decade later in life, and they kept giving him weapons there. And one of the weapons he was presented at Fort Elliott in the Texas Panhandle is on display. He kept it, and it's on display in the Panhandle Plains Museum. Now, as a teamster, Billy, as I said, traveled all over the frontier from fort to fort to fort, and he went all the way to Colorado. Well, that meant he got to see the Rocky Mountains. But by that time, he was already deeply in love with the plains country. He saw his first buffalo on the plains, saw his first horseback Indians on the plains. He loved outdoor life. He trapped and hunted, and he proved to be, again, a gifted marksman, just getting better all the time. Good enough by 1870 to start hunting buffalo for a living in Kansas. Now, he was given, he bought a Sharps Big 50. This is a cheap replica of a Sharps carbine, but it's very much the same kind of gun they had. This thing is, in fact, I forgot to bring, the cartridge looks like about an anti-aircraft gun, and then the slug is a great big soft lead slug. And this thing is a breech loader, and you open the breech like this. We're used to those Winchesters with the levers, but this was this was the way the Sharps worked. It was much bigger than this weapon. This is just a carbine, and the barrel on most of them was something like 32 inches. It was a very heavy weapon, 12, 15 pounds. It had, the really good ones had an octagonal barrel for extra strength because these guys overloaded those big old cartridges. Most of the buffalo hunters during the 70s used a Creedmoor tang sight. This is the tang right here. And the sight was attached to it, and it went up like this. And not only did you elevate that sight for distance, but also those things, you could actually move them a little bit to the right or to the left for windage. And of course, you're shooting buffalo on the plains, and they shot them at vast distances, 500 yards or so. They didn't want to get any closer than that because they'd stampede them. And they would fire those soft lead slugs at their vitals, not at their heads, because if you've ever seen buffalo skulls, they're very thick. And if you fire one at a buffalo skull, that soft lead just bounce off their skulls. And then they kind of go crazy. And that's what they were trying to avoid. And so he did that, and I got to tell you this. I was at museum after museum, mostly in West Texas, and got to handle a lot of buffalo guns, which was a thrill for me. And sometimes I didn't even have to wear the white little gloves. And then I made a trip to the NRA Museum in Springfield, Missouri. And they have the most magnificent displays of buffalo hunting with these kind of guns you ever saw. But within a few years, there was so much hunting that buffalo had disappeared from Kansas. Billy Dixon scouted out this vast herd in the Texas Panhandle. He did not want this period of his life to end. Well, some Dodge City merchants, he told them what he had seen. They gambled on establishing a trading post in the Panhandle for the buffalo trade. And most of you have that handout I gave. They came down with wagons and wagons full of goods and so forth. They located their little community just about a mile north of the ruins of an earlier trading post called Adobe Walls. A decade earlier, in 1864, Colonel Kit Carson had led an army column against a great big Indian force. He had 400 men, and he was terribly outnumbered during this battle. And so he had come over in 1864 from New Mexico and got after. They had a big time battle at the first battle of Adobe Walls. And 10 years later, in 1874, these buffalo guys, these merchants and stuff, they come up and they build 3 sod buildings. They didn't want to go down to where those old Adobe Walls ruins were. There was a big creek there, and that's how they had been able to make adobe, which is fairly rare in the Panhandle. So they built 2 sod stores. You'll notice the bottom and the top buildings are store buildings, and a sod saloon, and another guy built a little picket blacksmith shop. Now, there weren't any adobe buildings, but the name Adobe Walls, because of proximity, stuck. Buffalo hunters and skinners set up hunting camps all over the area, and they would come into Adobe Walls from time to time to get more ammunition, buy a new gun if something had happened, whiskey, and also bring in their hides. On June 27th, 1874, Billy Dixon happened to be at Adobe Walls on one of those trips. He had come in, he was going to leave on the morning of June 27th. He was up early. There were 20, he was one of 28 men there, and there was one woman too. The majority of those men were not hunters. The guys who were there all the time were store clerks. There was a bartender, a blacksmith. There was a guy that was a cook in one of the stores. And then one of the clerks had brought his wife, and she was a cook in that bottom store. And little did these people know it, that lurking around that far plateau that I told you about were 500 to 600 Comanche, Kiowa, and Arapaho warriors. There was Quanah. There was a young up-and-coming war leader who had helped recruit them named Quanah. That translates to fragrance. And then he was teamed with a very charismatic medicine man named Issachar. And the textbooks that I taught of very tactfully said, translated Issachar as coyote droppings. But the literal translation is wolf shit. And the reason he kept that name, mamas would name their babies from dreams that they had had while pregnant, or perhaps their husbands or something. And so if one of the parents has a dream about a big bear, well, they'd just go on and name the baby to be Big Bear. Might turn out to be a little girl. Well, if her life goes well, she don't want to change it. And that was the case with Issachar. He was the biggest, most powerful medicine man in the Comanche world. They went from band to band for months, recruiting warriors for a massive strike against these guys who were killing off their way of life. And so, with 500-600 of them, they came around that bend just as light began to break. Billy's already outside. He was by his wagon. You'll notice that was in front of the saloon. And he saw these people coming. And what is that? And he figured they were going for the horses, which were out in front of the little community. And so he thought he'd shoot a few of them before they got to the horses. And he turned around and he shot one of them, and those things are breech loaders, single shot. And before he can load that thing again, all of a sudden he realizes that they're all coming at him. Actually, there was a division that went for the horses and got them. But boy, he took off for that nearest building, which was the saloon, and banged on the door, and they let him in, and they were barricading door windows with sacks of grain and flour as fast as they could. And I mean seconds later, the Indians arrived and swarmed all around those three buildings. And they tried to, get through they tried to get their horses to kick the doors down. Some of the warriors jumped up on top of the sod roofs and tried to break through the turf with their spears and then shoot down in there. And it was a 30-minute firefight. It was one of the hairiest actions you ever heard of. And the buffalo hunters couldn't use their big guns. They had to go to their pistols and to their lever-action Winchesters for rate of fire. And within about half an hour, the Indians did break it off. Billy's fighting right side by side with the youngest guy there, Bat Masterson. And Billy was just 23, incidentally. And the warriors, meantime, had driven off all the horses. And in the siege to come, the horses that were left were inside those pens behind those two stores, and they managed to sneak around and kill all of them. There were 56 dead horses around and 28 dead oxen. The dead oxen belonged to the Shidler brothers. You will notice the Shidler brothers were in a wagon. They were teamsters, and they were sleeping in that wagon, and they didn't wake up in time to get to one of the buildings, so they hunkered down under the covers, hoping the Indians wouldn't notice. And after a while, a warrior stuck his head in the wagon, and the Shidler brother, one of them, shot him. And then the Indians went after that wagon, and they were sleeping with a dog. They had a great big old dog. And it didn't take long before the three of them were killed. They had to kill the dog because he was defending his masters, and they scalped the Shidler brothers, and then they scalped the dog as a gesture of honor to a brave warrior, Now, when the Indians finally withdrew, and the defenders managed to, stick their heads out the door and everything, there were 13 dead warriors. You know how the Indians would always carry off their dead and their wounded, but these guys were too close. And so they decapitated all 13 of them and stuck their heads on the post corrals. Day two, the warriors stayed at bay. There wasn't any group attack. They'd ride around sometime, think they thought they were out of range. Remember, they fired Winchesters with open sights. And so 100 yards, 150 yards, well, these guys, or at least some of them, about half of them, had those buffalo guns, and boy, they could hit something. And there were some terrific shots scored on day two. But day three came the most famous one. 15 warriors, approximately, gathered in a group overlooking the battlefield at one of those plateaus. And somebody said, "Billy, see if you can hit that guy." And he may have been on that far plateau. That's what everybody has always assumed, 7/8 of a mile. And he looked out there, and they were all, Billy, you can do this. And he was using a borrowed rifle, or I won't get into that. But if it was that one, it was 1,538 yards. That site has been surveyed. The nearer plateau is 1,028 yards. He sighted that thing. The idea was that he had in mind, there wasn't any way he could aim at one guy. And so what he did, he elevated that sight as high as he could, and he fired at a crazy elevation. And what he was trying to do was to drop his bullet right in the midst of those guys and hope he hit one. Now, if he miscalculated much, it'd sail over the group or fall short. But sure enough, he'd been doing this for a few years, killed thousands of buffaloes at some distance. And when you fire, and those guns generally had double set triggers, when you fire those things at that distance, it would take 5.3 seconds to hit. And the Indians wouldn't even have heard the report until 4.1 seconds. And then they got 1 second to kind of get out of the way. And sure enough, he hit somebody, knocked him out of his saddle, and his friends carried him off. And boy, that kind of broke their back, and that ended it. And I'll tell you what they did after that. When they broke off that siege, they knew these guys couldn't escape anyway. They didn't have any horses, and that would come a little bit later. They went after the hunters in their camps, and man, I mean, they scored well. They didn't kill, but 4 of the 28. They killed the 2 Scheidler brothers. They killed a guy who was trying to get in the back door, and he turned around to take a shot, and he caught a bullet in the lungs, and he died within about half an hour. And then the only other guy is, after the siege was over, one guy was on guard duty, and he was climbing down from his position at the roof. It was the guy that was married to the lady, and he kind of dropped, he had his gun like this, was careless, and that thing went off and sent one of those huge slugs up through his body, and his wife saw his head just explode. So that was very sad. But anyway, the Army decided, okay, this is enough. They planned a convergence, columns from 5 directions, 2 from different spots in Texas, 1 from New Mexico, 1 from Oklahoma, and 1 that would be commanded by General Nelson A. Miles, famous from the Civil War, to come down from the north from Dodge City. It took a few weeks, but Billy got back to Dodge City in time for Miles to enlist him as a scout. He was building a large scouting corps, and so consequently he enlisted Billy $75 a month. That was August of '74, and he would serve for nearly a decade until 1883. He was in 1 major combat. The scouts led a major combat that was a day-long fight. But then in September of '74, Billy and Amos Chapman, these 2 scouts were told that they were going to be couriers. They were promised, by the way, bonuses of $50 if they'd do it. They later collected. They had 4 enlisted men as an escort. They were supposed to take messages back to Camp Supply in Oklahoma, and they got almost to Oklahoma, and they got jumped. Now that monument is surrounded by foliage today, but in those days it was flat, wide open. They were hit by 125 warriors. They were outnumbered 20 to 1. Most of them got wounded in the first passing. The guy holding the horses as these guys dismounted to fight on foot, he got shot badly, and turned out it would be fatal. Chapman got his knee shattered, and it would have to later be amputated. Billy found a buffalo wallow nearby, and they all scampered over there and started digging with their knives to make it. It was about 10 feet, and they were trying to make it a little bit higher. And Billy went out and got Chapman and carried him in on his back. And then Billy and another guy carried that private in, and he died that night. Everybody had carbines except Billy. He had his buffalo gun, and he kept them at a distance. He was given the Medal of Honor for this action, and in those days, the War Department, no big ceremonies, the War Department delivered them by mail. But believe it or not, General Miles thought so well of this action that he put Dixon's medal on him in camp during that campaign in December. And he wrote him a personal letter, and both the medal and that letter are on display in the Panhandle Plains Museum. After that campaign ended in '75, Billy was permanently stationed at Fort Elliott at Mobeetie. He was there from ages 24 to 32. He had a home. First time in his adult life he had a home. And Mobeetie was just south of the fort, saloons and stuff. Bat Masterson came to visit him, got in a gunfight. By the way, other old friends were by. The Army officers really favored his company. This guy's got a Medal of Honor, you know. And so he had a good several years, upgraded his wardrobe, had a great several years there. He was discharged in '83 because there was no more Indian fighting at that point. It was over. And so he wants another home. he decides to create it at Adobe Walls. He goes there and got 2 sections of land, 1,280 acres. And he worked for a little while for the Turkey Track Ranch. The headquarters were nearby. And he decided to build a little cottonwood log cabin at the site of the first Adobe Walls because the water was better out of that creek. And he irrigated an alfalfa field. Remember, he'd been raised a farmer. He had 30, 40 acre field. And he sold most of the hay to the Turkey Track. He didn't have much livestock. He later built a lean-to and added it in. He got a couple of buildings that the Turkey Track was trying to get rid of, and he dragged them down there and tacked them onto this thing. Another settler abandoned his cabin, and Billy got it up here. He had one of about the biggest house in the Panhandle. It was an old rambling thing, but he had that. He irrigated a fruit orchard, had 200 fruit trees in it. He ran a little store for cowboys who would come by, and guess what their favorite thing was? It wasn't tobacco. They were buying candy and gum from him. He operated a post office for years. He was the only post official in that area. He was a justice of the peace. He was a Texas land agent. The guy had all kinds of stuff going for him. And still, there weren't very many people in the county. The census of 1890 counted 58 people in Hudson County. And so he had plenty of time to hunt with his dogs. He led an idyllic life for a decade. And then he met a school marm from back east. And she was visiting a cowboy brother. And boy, did his life change. Olive King re-enters our picture. She was an adventurous pioneer woman of the Panhandle, a rural school marm who fell in love with the country and with this iconic hero of the Texas Panhandle. Now, she knew something about Indian fighting heroes because she was born in Virginia, like Billy was. Of course, she was born the year before. There's an age gap, Adobe Walls. She was the 8th of 10 children, 5 boys, 5 girls. Her great-great-grandfather was General Andrew Lewis. There are statues of him at his town. He was a hero of the French and Indian War and the American Revolution. He led a great victory over the Shawnee in 1774. The exploits of General Lewis were drilled into Olive, which nurtured a sense of history in the little girl. Her daddy was a Confederate soldier in the Civil War. Then he ran a tobacco farm on the Lewis Grant, but tobacco is very hard on the soil. It exhausts the soil. And so that King farm was about worn out when smallpox visited the family home in 1880. 7-year-old Olive was one of several family members who caught it. Her face was pockmarked, but she was just 7 and she outgrew it. And her face did not bear those marks. The father was the only one to die. Well, boy, did that cause a problem. What are they going to do? The oldest son had already moved off. The 2 oldest sisters, they were married and had moved off. One of them took the next oldest sister into her home out of state. The next 3 brothers would work the farm. They were just kids. That left 7-year-old Olive, a 4-year-old little sister, and a toddler brother at home, plus a couple of grandmothers, both of whom moved in to try to help out. That's a lot of mouths to feed. So little Olive, it was decided, would go live with cousin Dora King Wade, who was married to a prosperous building contractor in Decatur, Alabama. Cousin Dora had 2 sons. She was delighted at the opportunity to raise a quote daughter. She just had 2 old boys. The Wades owned a big 2-story home with servants. Olive would have her own room, clothes, schooling. She was traumatized, however. She wasn't but 7 years old, just lost her daddy, and now they're telling her she's going to move off to Alabama to see somebody she's never seen. Wow, she didn't want to leave her playmate little sister, her little brother. But when she left on a train for Alabama, she tearfully but dutifully told her family, told her mother, said, "I'll be good, Mother. I'll try so hard and I'll be good." She was treated wonderfully, generously by Cousin Dora and her family. She enjoyed comforts undreamed of on that old worn-out farm back home. She had piano lessons. They lived across the street from Methodist Church. Cousin Dora was devout, and Olive became so, devout Methodist. The big house was open to a circle of her girlfriends. Then at 16, she finished high school. Her adopted family wanted her to go to college, or at least to a normal, to teach. But she longed to be with her mother and the few siblings who remained at the Virginia tobacco farm. So after a final summer with cousin Dora, Olive moved back to the hardscrabble Virginia farm. Her older brothers had all moved out on their own by now. And so two of them, Albert and Archie, in the 1880s, they were just still kind of kids, they headed for the Texas Panhandle to become cowboys on one of America's last frontiers. They were, that was a great adventure. In time, both of them would become successful ranchers out here, but when Archie was still a young cowboy on the Bar Seas with a few head of cattle of his own, he married, had a baby boy. The wife's name was Sina. So he wrote his sister Olive, who was now 19, going on 20, inviting her to come to Texas for a visit, and he sent a train fare. So she was just as adventurous as her cowboy brothers. She made this long, long train journey to Canadian Texas. Brother Archie picked her up there in a wagon. They drove 50 miles to his dugout, just north of the Canadian River. She had a grand time with her brother and sister-in-law and the little baby who was named after her daddy. She fell in love with this open, windswept land. She loved the isolated people who lived on this frontier, sparsely settled. There were picnics and fishing trips, 4th of July dance, a Thanksgiving feast that had 30 people at it. She said it was everybody in the county, and it almost was. She was courted by cowboys, but nothing clicked. Sina got pregnant, and Olive decided that she better leave. The little dugout's going to get too crowded. She didn't want to go back to Virginia, but she was asked to teach a little 5-student rural school just south of the Canadian River. Now, her students are going to be from two families. One of them is the oldest boy, and the others were 4 children. And they didn't have room in their homes. She couldn't keep living with the brother because he was above the river and the school was down here, and the Canadian flooded a lot during the winters. But she found a family who took her in. There were 2 Lewis brothers running a small spread, and there was a little boy there, and Mrs. Lewis wanted female companionship. So Olive got herself certified at the nearest courthouse, which wasn't very near, and she rode to school each day, just a few miles. George would meet her halfway, and then Billy Dixon entered her life. Billy lived 5 miles away at Adobe Walls, and he, like a lot of cowboys, brought a load of wash to Mrs. Lewis. And that's when he was introduced to Olive, asked him to stay for supper, and one thing led to another, and he's coming by every week. Didn't have that much wash, but since he's a regular, he brings all kinds of fruit from his orchard, and he was very welcome. Mrs. Lewis is a matchmaker. They got married at the Lewis home on October 18, 1894. Billy was 44, and she said she didn't even know how old he was, and she was just 21, but they were soulmates. At Billy's rambling house at Adobe Walls, he had mail-ordered brand new sheets for the honeymoon. He bought her a majestic wood-burning cook stove, and that was state of the art. And when she got pregnant, he brought a rocking chair from Canadian, brand new, and she got pregnant a lot. They had in 15 years, they had 8 kids, no twins. She was always pregnant or nursing or something. No medical assistance. By the way, one of the baby girls died, and they raised 7. After a decade, Billy was forced to sell his little spread to the vast Turkey Track Ranch nearby. He had built a 2-story frame house for his growing family, and what he did was he had it skidded down jacked it up and moved it down to the brand new little county seat, first county seat that Hutchinson County had, 14 miles from the ranch. It was Plymouth's. He became a Mason, but basically he hated town life. And I go in the book about why he did. So anyway, he decided he wanted one last frontier experience. The Oklahoma Panhandle had just been opened to homesteaders, and so he files on a 160-acre claim. and they leave the town, and by the way, the majestic cooking stove, which Olive missed more than anything, I think. Billy built a 3-room cabin for his family, and then he literally worked himself to death trying to scratch out a living from this harsh land. He died of pneumonia. In 1913, he was just 62. Billy and Olive had been married for 19 years, and then Olive was a widow for the next 43 years. She wound up in Amarillo after moving to several places, to including Roberts County, by the way, to raise her family. And she had 7 kids raised. The oldest kid was 17 when Billy died. She wasn't left any resources, but in any event, she got that done. And she would die in Amarillo at 83 in 1956. But during the 1890s and early 1900s, she had lived a hard, primitive, isolated life of a pioneer woman. A few years ago in Midland, at a meeting of the West Texas Historical Association, I talked about genus Historianus Herbidus. Dr. C.L. Sonnichsen coined that phrase whimsically, and it meant grassroots historian. Well, Olive Dixon became a grassroots historian of the first order, despite only a high school education, which incidentally, when she graduated from high school, fewer than 1 out of 10 Americans got a high school. 90-some-odd% did not have a high school education. So that was pretty good that she had that. But she started interviewing her husband late in life. She kept notebooks everywhere, even out in the stable, in case he started talking out there. And I don't know why he started talking to her. A lot of his friends were urging him to do that. And so she dutifully took it down, and she kept the jargon. Boy, it's just like talking to him almost, except we don't hear the sound of his voice. I heard the sound of her voice, incidentally, on a radio recording that she did, and it is at Hutchinson County. And so I did it. She still had that Virginia lilt. She was an older lady, but had the Virginia lilt. I'm speaking here to the Olive's great nephew, a niece. Is that great? One great? Or two greats? 2 greats, okay. And so, anyway, after he died, she did create a classic frontier biography of him. It came out in 1914. She had to take a $500 loan at high bank interest, and it took her more than a decade to pay that thing back. But it was, boy, the rest of us are certainly the better off for it. After she got all those kids raised, she did move to Amarillo for the rest of her long life. She got into history work. She became a very active grassroots historian. She became a charter vice president of the Panhandle Plains Historical Society. She was on the building committee of the Panhandle Plains Museum. If you go in that museum today in Canyon, you walk in and you look up to the left, and her name is engraved over the entrance. Mrs. Billy Dixon, part of the building committee. She made significant contributions to the holdings of the museum. She donated, among the earliest donations were hers, and she donated Billy's Medal of Honor. A few years after Billy died, the Army decided they wanted all the medals back that were awarded to civilians, and he was technically a civilian scout, even though he was employed by the Army. And so they wrote to her, among others, and requested the Medal of Honor back. Well, it didn't even cross her mind to give it back to him, or the letter, nor any of the other stuff she had. And so she ultimately donated. You can see it in the Panhandle Plains Museum, along with that letter from General Miles. She led, along with a lot of other stuff, by the way, she led the movement to erect a monument at Adobe Walls. And if you've ever been out there, you've seen the monuments actually that are there. She had to do a lot of the money raising. And she was a woman with zero resources. She led the movement to erect a monument at the Buffalo Wallow. And she led the movement to move Billy's grave from Texline. When he died, the nearest Texas cemetery, he didn't want to be buried in Oklahoma, And so they put him down in Texline, which was the nearest community, Texas community. And now she wanted him out at Adobe walls, and she knew how to do this kind of thing by now, so she got it done. The newspapers announced the move, and on the day of the move, here came a funeral home donated both their vehicle and a better casket. And so the day that casket was transferred from Texline out to Adobe walls, it was in the newspaper, and people were there, and whenever they saw that procession come by, you know, the men took their hats off and so forth. It was a big day in the Panhandle, and he was buried where he should have been buried, which incidentally not only is the site of his most famous exploit, but also of his favorite home. She became involved in all manner of other history projects. She went to Dodge City for various occasions. She went to the Custer battlefield for the 50th anniversary. And I just wonder, I don't know if Libby Custer was there. I've got to look that up. She and Libby Custer were so similar. George got killed in his 30s. Of course, Billy lived longer than that. And so she was younger when she became a widow than Olive was. Olive was just about 40. But she lived to be about 90. So she lived 50. She was a widow for 53 years. Olive was a widow for 43 years. And they both promoted their military hero husbands. Olive, at all of these things, she was asked to speak at all kinds of events. Olive wrote a stream of historical newspaper pieces. She was on the staff of the Amarillo Globe until the day she died. And she even published a couple of historical articles for Ranch Romances magazine, so she was nationally published. Despite her lack of formal training, Olive Dixon became a foremost grassroots historian of the Texas Panhandle. She was a true historianus herbidus, I can tell you. She was, I know one reader of this book, Mary Sue Potts, I bet some of you know her. She said, well, I liked your book, and boy, Billy was really something else, but Olive's my hero. She said, so this is a book perhaps about two different heroes, and it just came out fairly recently, and again, the first biography of Billy in quite a long time. And after I got into it, I was really proud that I got to work with that piece of material and those kind of people. If there's another happening in here in just a minute, but any questions, anybody? We might have time for a question or two if any of you are interested. I have the book over here. It's 1995. There are 100 images in it. Actually, there were going to be 101 images in it, and I knew the publisher would have a cow if he saw 100 photos, you know, and so I eliminated 2, and it's down to 99 now or something. But anyway, rounded off, there's 100 images in it. And again, I so appreciate your attention here. You're coming in on late on a Saturday afternoon, and it's certainly a privilege to get to share a little bit of this story with a direct descendant. Billy, there's a lady named Virginia Maynard in Amarillo, and Virginia was a granddaughter of Billy and Olive. She never knew Billy, but she and I contacted each other by mail and phone. And last year, when I was at this event, just like today, I did not have I had a couple of Friday events, and then I didn't have anything until 2 o'clock today. So she and I made a date, and I got up early, and I drove up to Amarillo, and highballed on up there on the interstate, and got with her. I got there on time, and she had all this stuff laid out, and she had all manner of memories that she was able to share of her grandmother, and then, of course, her grandmother told her some about Billy as well. And she allowed me to use various photos that are in the book and everything. And so yours is the second contact I've had with a descendant, and it was a thrill to get to meet her, because she lived. She was a teenager when Olive finally died. Well, again, thank you so much for coming, and hope to see you next year.